data and the impact that it can have in various different sectors. As Ilkay alluded to, I'm from the Open Data Institute, and we were set up just 5 years ago now. It's actually our 5th birthday this year. By Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Sir Nigel Shadbolt, to look at what the value of open data is and really start unlocking it as a new raw material, as such it is these days, one that everyone can use simultaneously. And so that also presents many challenges, but also a complete set of opportunities for new insight to be gained from this vast quantity of material. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the topics around that material, specifically about how do we start discovering where it is. If we say that it's now ubiquitous and absolutely everywhere, well, what does that mean, and how do we start to find this data? How do we establish the quality of that data, and why is the provenance important? I'll talk a little bit about that. But the main focus will then be into the data analysis and visualization, because we're going through a phase at the moment globally where a lot of the analysis and visualization that's being presented to us, we have to again ask questions about that. So can we trust it? Is it a real story? Is it a fake story, etc.? Because you can tell lots of different stories from data. And then we'll have a look at the importance then of the science behind it all. So referencing that data, using it in policy cycles as well, we'll look at the end. And these make up the 5 key topics that are in this week's set of resources. So these map exactly to those topics. So I'm going to give a brief overview in this session of some of the content that is within the lessons that you can read about this week. And hopefully that should help to inspire and connect you to those resources, to make it make a little bit more sense potentially than the vast quantity of resources that are there that might seem a bit overwhelming. We've had a lot of comments so far on that it's very useful for people, and there's a lot to think about. So perhaps I can just help bring that together for you within this webinar. Obviously, if you would like to ask questions, then please do in the chat alongside Ilkay, and I've got a colleague Pauline who will also keep an eye on the chat as well and let me know anything that I'm missing. But yeah, if you've got anything you want to ask, then do please put those in the chat as we go. And remember, again, there's a tutorial that we did, and David, you can ask extra questions.
David?
Hello.
Sorry, David. Okay, just to say, you can actually, if you can speak a little bit slower, that will be a great help. Thank you.
Not a problem, thank you. That's right, thank you. Okay, so hopefully everyone's now tested their sound. Okay, I've noticed a few people not so clear, but hopefully people are getting along. So let's have a little look through the first of our topics then. So let's have a look at the first one in discovering open data. So if this new raw material, this resource is becoming abundant, how do we find open data on the web? And this slide is actually very appropriate, because the whole idea of having an abundance of data on the web is that we should be able to find it using our traditional methods such as search engines. A lot of initiatives started looking at things like having a government portal, and these are great for being able to track what it is that governments are publishing, have a look at the health of an initiative, and these have been used within many of the measures that are out there. But they also present challenges in the fact that they look at a kind of centralization of data. There's a lot of data that doesn't necessarily get listed within these portals that is also completely relevant to the research that you might be doing. So there might be data coming from other non-governmental departments or academia or other research organizations or even the commercial sector. So it's very important to consider that, actually when people are publishing data, they should use as much metadata as possible to make it clear that this is data and make it searchable by those search engines. We've become very good at creating content online that's searchable, and when we create websites now, one of the key things that we understand is about search engine optimization for those websites. And the same should be true of data. So you should be able to type data in your search query and start to actually find some of those resources that are out there and links to those services and that data that you can then either download or access via machine interfaces. But if you want to know what's out there from government, then often the data.gov.XX pattern that I'm showing here is a very good way of finding out what kind of initiative a country might have, and that might point you towards other sources of data as well. But I said about using search engines, and one of the nice things that you can do within a search engine, like Google or other search engines, is use these prefixes. I've noticed I've actually lost the picture here, but you can use these prefixes in your search. So my favourite one here is the last one, file type with a colon on the end of it. And if you put this in your Google search or your whatever search engine you're using, so file type colon, and then just the file type, say XLS, for example, and then put a search term. So you might put agriculture, for example. Then this will find you everything that references agriculture, but only XLS files. So when you click on them, they should directly download. So this is one way of cutting past web pages and looking directly for data. And there are many other prefixes that you can use in order to customize your Google search or your whatever search engine you're using to make it much more specific, much more tailored to what you're trying to find. So this is a really useful way of uncovering that data that's kind of hidden in the web. Another tool or technique that's out there for you is to look for the portals and the aggregators that are bringing a lot of this data together from around the world. In order to give access to it at a kind of aggregated level. So this is, rather than you having to go to every single country or each individual portal, you can have a look at some of the aggregators that are collecting and managing these statistics that are being produced by different governments or different organizations. And the FAO, who are hosts, or Work4 is a very good example of where you can get a lot of these kind of aggregated statistics from their databases. And a lot of them I've been looking at in terms of using them and for doing sorts of different types of visualization. There are others such as the World Bank. They also have a lot of agricultural statistics from different countries that enable you to easily compare your performance of one country against another. And these kind of high-level statistics that come from statistical agencies tend to be widely available on these types of portals. But not all data is available in nice machine and structured formats. So what do you do in that case? So some data, might be available in a structured format, but not necessarily being machine readable. You might have to resort to something like scraping that data either off of a website or out of a PDF. And these two tools can help you with that. So Import.io is a startup who are looking at being able to get data from the web. So if you see a table that's embedded within a web page of data that you can use, but there's no download button or there's no way to easily access it, then they have a way of being able to help you extract that data from that web page. But likely you're going to find a lot of data that might be within PDFs. And I've got an example here that if you go to the Tanzanian National Bureau of Statistics and you search for what did I have a look at? Agriculture here. Then you've got a lot of different statistics around, again, crop surveys, crop report, planning, census, lots of different things. And you can see the top one here has over 3,000 hits on it. But if you go into this, you get a web page and it says here, click download the report. And you download the report and you find within it that you get tables and tables in the appendices of the PDF that look a lot like this, and lots of useful statistics in here about the breakdown across the country, but not instantly usable for you because it's all embedded within a PDF. And so if you use PDF tables, and here's an example of something that I did with this exact one, just go to pdftables.com and upload this page, and just by dragging and dropping it gives you an extracted version of the data that you can see there at the top. You can instantly download as Excel. So even when data might be, there might be a reason for it being in a PDF, it might need the explanation, or the publisher hasn't made a machine readable version available, or the publisher doesn't want to make the machine readable version available, then there are tools like this that can help you, get a hold of that data. Something to bear in mind, obviously, is your right to use that data. So just make sure that you do have that right, and you do have the license to use the data. That's something that was covered within Unit 1. So that was a little bit on discovering. There's a lot more techniques to discovering that you can look at within this unit, including using machine APIs as well. So let's have a look at briefly about quality and provenance. Whenever we talk about data, whenever the ODI talks about data at any point, quality tends to be the topic that we talk about most. There are two main reasons for this. It's either that publishers are apprehensive to actually release their data because they're worried about the quality of it, or the reusers are worried about whether they'll be making accurate decisions for their company or whatever based upon this data, so they're also worried about the same aspect, the quality of it. Obviously, you can have interesting conversations, and we certainly have done at the ODI around, well, if the quality of the data isn't good enough to publish, then is the data being used to make decisions already within government? So, are we making bad decisions based upon bad quality data already? And that could be a worry for a lot of people. As I say, especially if that data is already in widespread use within government. But how do you deal with this kind of quality problem? And how do you know what kind of quality data set exists? Historically, there's been two real measures of open data that are out there that I'm going to just allude to, but not really go into a lot. One of them is the 5 stars of linked open data, which is mentioned within this unit, but also within Unit 4. And the other one is the open data certificates, which we've already talked about a lot within the tutorial that we had the other day. Open data certificates are a little bit different from the 5 stars, as they look more widely at the initiative and the publishing initiative that's going on, and look at the usability of the data rather than its technical quality. So the open data certificates, for those who've never come across this before, it's basically a questionnaire. And so what you can do is you can look at the data set that is published, or you can, as a publisher, you can fill in this questionnaire about your practices to see what kind of gaps you've got in your data that is preventing it from being used. And that goes beyond quality, because it might just be about the description of it. It might be about your it might be around the description of it. It might be around the support that you provide for it. People are not sure, well, who actually owns this data? Who can I go to if I need help with this data? Those can all help with the trust. And so you can go to the certificate site, and it asks you a series of questions like where is your data, what's the title of it, etc. And at the end of the process, you get a quality mark going from bronze to silver to gold all the way up to platinum. And this is something that you could choose to put on a data set, or again, you could choose to use the certificates as kind of a guideline to say, well, we'd like to get to the silver level across our entire organization, which is a good level to try and get to, but what gaps do we have within our processes or within the data? So the kind of things that the certificates focuses on are actually all these questions, the who, what, when, and where. So things like who collected it, who owns it, who is the audience for it. So if you are collecting a data set, surely it must have a purpose. Why is it being collected? What is it used for internally? Again, the where was it collected? Where is it located? Where is it about? And the when was it collected? So over what period of time? So when should we use it? When will it next get updated? These are all questions that, for a lot of the time when we find data on the web, we don't know when it'll be updated. When do the next year's statistics actually come online? And these are things that you don't know until you become more of an expert in a domain. But it might be a lot easier for people to do that if we actually describe that properly. So these are all the types of questions that the certificate asks you about the data set. And this is completely different from the approach of the 5 stars. The 5 stars takes a much more technical approach to say, well, in order for it to be good quality technically, it has to be online under an open license. It has to be in a reusable format. It has to be in an open format. It has to use web identifiers. And these are all technical things, which actually, if you do all of these, it doesn't actually guarantee that the data itself is of any higher quality. It's technically more brilliant, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's of higher quality in itself or described any better. And so that's why the ODI created the certificates, because it's more of something that a whole organization can get to grips with, rather than open data remaining something that tends to be a technical problem on this diagram, when actually it's not. It's more of a cultural problem. So that's where the certificates can help. But in both cases, you're still going to end up with data that's going to need quality checking in finite detail, because all data, like all algorithms, at some point involves a human. either in writing the algorithm, or collecting the data, or typing it into a database, or a form, or a spreadsheet. And we all interpret things in different ways. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it just does cause things like consistency problems. So one year we might refer to something as the Department of Agriculture within a university. And the next year we might be referring it to the School of Agriculture within a university. And this is about, changing of brands and things that are quite logical to do. However, they do cause a problem in consistency of the data if you're trying to compare the performance of this department or school or faculty or whatever it is over a great number of years. And so being able to detect these inconsistency problems and being able to deal with them is something you're still going to have to do, even if the publisher says the data is of really high quality. So OpenRefine is a tool that can help you fix dirty data, clean up that data, or fix those inconsistency problems, or even just identify them. It can help you where people might have spelt things wrong or added abbreviations to the end of things. And I would highly recommend following the exercise that is within the quality and provenance of lesson 2.2 that takes you through how to use Refine. At the ODI, when we do each of our stories, we've always used Refine to take a look at the data to make sure that we don't have inconsistency problems before we go forward and have a look at what the data is actually telling us. And a number of years ago, we worked with a project in Burkina Faso where we were looking at the performance of schools. And even in this data set, which wasn't the biggest data set in the world, there were still over 23,000 inconsistency problems in that small data set, which we managed to clean up in Refine in a matter of about 20 to 30 minutes. So it really goes to show what such a powerful tool can do to help you when you're analysing your data. And as I say, it doesn't always mean that the data will be of bad quality from the publisher. It just means that potentially for your particular usage, you need to clear up some of the inconsistencies within that data in order to do your analysis. So I'd highly recommend having a look at OpenRefine. So I've got about 10 or 15 minutes left, so let's have a look at data analysis and visualization, which is the next unit. This is lesson 2.3 within there. So once you've cleaned up your data and fixed its inconsistencies, and you've done potentially a little bit of exploring the data to see whether it's the right data for you telling your story, the next stage will be actually to do some of the analysis in more depth. And there are two types of analysis that we tend to refer to: the quantitative, and that's with numbers basically, and the qualitative with your kind of free text. But you have to remember that not all data is structured. Not all numeric data is structured, and some text data is structured. So both of these methods can apply to both types of data. It's not just about whether it's numbers or text. So it's about more than just that, about the characteristics about whether it's structured or not, allow you to do different types of analysis on that data. So extracting term count from a qualitative data set will allow you to do some quantitative analysis on that, for example. So when you're analysing quantitative data, what should you look out for? One of the most important things to look out for in quantitative data is the distribution or the shape of that data. So does the data have a normal distribution, or is it related to some kind of power curve, etc.? What is that distribution of data? Often we do things like compare averages. So this is on the right-hand side here. You can see some data about the East African countries on their banana yield. Over the years since 1960s all the way up to last year. And what you can see, if you put this in different types of visualizations, it shows you different patterns within the data. So whether it's, there's a growing trend. But, putting it in this type of box and whiskers visualization shows you the averages, the medians, and the outliers. And this is always something we get caught up with as well. The human brain is very good at looking at outliers. We get very interested in things that don't follow the normal pattern, and then we'll try and explain them, when often they don't follow the normal pattern just because of random distribution or chance. There's no real explanation, there's no real significance to it. Okay, but there's just an outlier within the data. And this is something you always have to be aware of when analysing quantitative data, is those statistical methods. And it's worth talking to a statistician and not just doing, random analysis on the data that might lead to the wrong conclusion. And again, there are a few examples within this week's module of where that happens. So, for example, here you can see within Malawi, there seems to be a lot. This is your 50% is what's highlighted with the grey bars of the data. And there seems to be quite a lot of outliers in Malawi and also in Kenya at the top end. And if you drew this on a line graph, it would look as if the banana yield has been growing in the years, which indeed it has. But still, if you consider all of the data, this is still not the norm. So things to be aware of then when you're looking at analysing data, and I've got a lovely XKCD comic on here. I don't know how many people have seen these kind of things. Be aware of the influence that things like targets have. So if you set a target for someone to achieve in the data, in their work, for example, then people are going to focus on this and not necessarily on a better outcome. If the target might become the sole thing that's focused on within the data, and that influences the analysis that you do. So being aware that targets exist within the data is very important. Chance is another thing. Chance. So when random events cluster, so the chance of two things happening at the same time is actually higher than we think it is. Humans are not very random, and so be aware of that. Fluctuation is another big one. So when something seems to be at a peak, then inevitably the next thing that might happen is it will get worse. It doesn't mean it will keep getting better. So this often happens within economies and the stock markets. It keeps rising and keeps rising. Does it look as if the economy is recovering? Well, fluctuation dictates that it will probably go down at some point. And then my favorite, which is correlation and causation, which is what this XKCD comic is all about. Have a quick read if you can see that. Just because something looks correlated doesn't mean that there is a causal link between the two things. So just in that example, does cancer cause cell phones? So, interesting. Doesn't make any logical sense, but it brings up the point about if just because something does make some kind of logical sense doesn't always mean that there is a causal relationship between two things. When you're analysing qualitative data, so that kind of text data, you are trying to look at, extracting a lot of the time themes from that data, either with coding or thematic data analysis. And although we're not going to, we often don't do a lot of this within data, there are some really interesting tools that have been out there for a good number of years to help you do this. And the one that I'm showing here is a little tool called OpenCalais, which tags the data and recognizes the topics that are being talked about within it. OpenCalais is trained upon the news data from around the world, so it's very good at picking up different news feeds and trends, and this is often used in a lot of those news trackers which look at mentions of a particular topic and discussion around that. And so you can have a look at this online. And what's quite nice about OpenCalais as a product is it pulls out key topics and then links them to all the other articles or places where that thing has been mentioned. And so you can really start to explore text-based data and pages on the web for the first time as if they are a network of data with similar topics talked about in them, and navigate the web in a slightly different way using these types of tools. But they're also very good for that thematic analysis of, well, what did people actually talk about? What are the key words that are going to get extracted? And so if you're doing any type of qualitative data analysis, have a go at putting your text into this tool and see what it does with it. So after you've done your analysis, the part that people really want to get to is onto visualization. And we've got a lot of people creating a lot of visualizations at the moment, but this doesn't mean that all the visualizations out there are good. So I just wanted to do a little bit of a chat briefly in this webinar around what to do when visualizing data and what not to do. The first thing to do before you get onto visualizing data is to consider three key things. First one is audience. So who are the audience? Are you talking to politicians? Are they going to be happy consuming a lot of data visually? Do they expect more of a written prose or a summary? And see what and what kind of form do they expect it in? Would it appeal better through a magazine or a paper-based interaction, or would it be better through a mobile phone or on Facebook, etc.? So consider these things about how you engage. The second thing is the purpose. What story are you trying to tell? And this is something that gets lost in a lot of visualizations out there, is that people create a visualization that actually doesn't tell the story that they're wanting to tell. So they have to create a whole massive narrative around the visualization in order to explain what it is that is there. And if we look at this grid on the previous page, there are actually not many of these visualizations that you can tell what the story might be. Tell what you're meant to be looking at within the data. You've got so take the one on the second row, third from the left. Lots of points that are connected together, but what are we looking at? What story are we trying to tell? There's a lot of these they look complex, but to the human brain, they're not very easy to consume without a big complex explanation. So think of your purpose carefully. And then lastly, think of the data. What types of visualizations suit the data? And again, I've seen quite a lot, and there's some good examples and websites out there that collect these together where people use completely the wrong visualization. So, for example, using a line chart for a data set that is just observations of something. They're not observations over time, they're just observations of something. But a line chart suggests some kind of trend, that some kind of going in a direction. You read left to right or right to left. And so depending on that, you'll read the chart as a trend that's either growing or shrinking. But sometimes I've seen line charts used for data where it isn't a time series, or it doesn't want, it shouldn't be representing a trend, and so something like a histogram might work better. So all of these will help to eliminate which visualizations you should use. And quite often you might end up back at something quite simple. So, and simple visualizations are good for the eye. So here is a good example on this slide. Have a little look. This is the same data shown in two different forms. So which country achieved the greatest crop yield in 2014 is what the title says. So which one do you think? Don't know if you can see the names of the countries, but which country achieved the greatest crop yield in 2014, and which chart did you get it from? Remember to tell me which chart you got it from. So has anyone got the answer from these two visualizations? Which they're both of the same data. Which country achieved the greatest crop yield? They're both of the crop yield data. A few responses. Yes, Uganda is the correct one. Not sure whether it's easier to see for you. So on the left-hand side, you've just got the bars, bar chart of 2014. Okay, so the biggest one is Uganda. So that should, the greatest crop yield, the biggest one is Uganda. So that your eye is drawn towards the biggest bar. On the right-hand one, it's actually presenting the whole time series. And the only way of really seeing which one is which is by the labels, which fortunately are placed in order. So that Uganda is the top one. Again, they're not as clear. I would argue that the one with the bar chart in, your eye is drawn towards what the biggest one is, as opposed to the smallest one. So because they're in an order and your eye is drawn towards it, it should be much easier to see. So the point about that is nothing wrong with a bar chart. But as people mentioned with that last one quite rightly, is if the labels are too small or the chart axis are not correct, etc., you might try and read too much into it, or you can't see it appropriately. So here's another couple of examples of bar charts, but with most of the clutter removed. So the one on the left is actually, you have to look at it for a little bit longer than you might be expected to realize that this is comparing the revenue from iPhone sales to the whole revenue of Microsoft in one quarter. So it says that one product earned more revenue than the whole of another company, which just goes to show that a vast difference between the two. So, not as clear, but you have to read into it a little bit. But you can see straight away, just from the bars there, that, the iPhone one is bigger than the Microsoft one. So your eye is drawn towards it, but potentially there's still an understanding gap. The same is true a little bit of the one on the left, as well, the one on the right. Gun deaths in 2015 versus terrorism deaths of all time, since they've been recorded, since terrorism was a thing in the US. And you can see the vast difference between the two. So see how you don't necessarily need all the axis and the clutter around it when, something can become obvious just presented like that. I mentioned about line charts for over the years. So if you've got a time series, which this is a really interesting example from the New York Times, which allowed you to draw what you thought was the trend during the Obama years. So this was showing here the unemployment rate over the Bush years, and you could draw on here what you thought happened over the Obama years, and this enabled them to collect a huge amount of data of what people actually knew before thought the truth was. So a really nice way of presenting that so that people actually learn from the story, just very simply though. So I've got a couple of minutes just to go through the last bit, which is, again, I said there's a lot in this week, which is, well, how then do we use all of this? If we are communicating a story and doing our data analysis, how do we start to use this within things like policy cycles within government? So in lesson 2.4, there's a little bit about how you might consider using open data when you're formulating policy. And we've split it into, there's open data in and open data out. So at the top, you've got open data in terms of, well, how do we set the agenda and formulate the policy? And then open data out around enacting and evaluating that policy, so it's continuous monitoring. And open data can help at every stage. So let's have a look at an example policy, which is related to our last point around referencing. Our example policy is to publish, we want more data, open data, to be published from universities on agriculture. Why aren't we getting all of the research data published that we can access? So why do we want it? So increase the benefit from the data and improve agriculture worldwide. But what we've got to consider if we want this policy enacted is what are the benefits to those who already hold the data. So let's have a look at the policy setting part of the cycle for a second. Universities are ranked on the quality of their research, which is linked to publication. Therefore, we want to think about it, if data publication can hold the same value as existing scholarly publication, then we should see more data. So we need to link the reward to the action. So that's the hypothesis here. So how research creates impact, as I say, so journal publication and the number of citations a paper has. So how might we do this for data? So in our policy cycle, we might say something like, well, we need to create, as part of our enactment process, reputable places to share data, a way to link or reference the data, including an index, and then potentially mandate the publication of the research data, much like it is, and reward that within institutions and domains that you have to publish in order to become reputable in that domain, and mandate for it. So those are three things that we could do. And these are three things that were done by a number of services, including DataCite, which created this whole idea of being able to cite data, so data set citation, or DOIs. And so by creating a scheme in which people could reference data and reference parts of data, and they created a way for that kind of reward mechanism, so the number of dataset citations that are then used and then referenced within organizations. And we can see here on the right, then using the open data, well, how many of those have now been created? What's the uptake of this looking like? What's the size of our community? And we can see here that the total number of DOIs by the beginning of 2016 is around the 6.5 million compared to much earlier. So you can see the exponential growth in this kind of activity, showing that the policy of saying, well, if we create some kind of reward mechanism for our data referencing, then we might get more published and thus more that can be used by people. So that was just a little recap very quickly, and I combined the last two because of time into one particular area. But as I say, you can read a lot more about them in the lessons that are there for this week. But it's a large and complex area, but it provides a huge amount of opportunity now with the amount of data that's out there to use it in new and interesting ways. And we're continuously seeing more data become available than people might think. But again, it's being made available in lots of different ways. And so one of the most complex things at the moment is actually that discovering where is the data, how do I access that data, and then what's the quality of that data. So what's that kind of community's effort. So I'll leave it there for today. That's about just under 40 minutes. Apologies for the length. But if anyone's got any questions, please do type them in the chat, and then